everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Way the World Works, a Tuttle Twins podcast. So on the last episode, we talked about Shays' Rebellion and how this was like the final nail in the coffin of the Articles of Confederation, because whether you love them or hate them, and some people feel both ways, the Articles were not working out. They just weren't among the states. There was no real strong central authority that could even enforce what was in the Articles of Confederation, which is why people started realizing, like, okay, maybe we need something better. However, they weren't actually given permission to write something better. So the way that the Constitution's, like the draft of it even came about was a little bit against the rules, if you could say that. So we're going to get into that right now. So this starts with the Annapolis Convention, and this is happening in September 1786. So you have to remember, this is a month after Shays' Rebellion is going on. Now, whether or not every single person at the Annapolis Convention knew everything that was going on with Shays, I don't know, because the way correspondence worked back then was so different than it is today. Here, something big can happen and you find out within 3 seconds. Back then, you had to wait for letters to be carried. And so I don't know how much everybody knew, but everybody knew that there were weaknesses, and I'm sure it was on people's mind later on. But so Annapolis Convention is happening. And this was just kind of an idea to maybe think about some possible revisions to the Articles of Confederation. Clearly, this is not working great. So, you know what, let's just meet, let's talk about it. But not that many people were there. So I think not even half of the delegates from the states showed up. So this is a very small convention. This is not a big thing. But it does lead the way to the Constitutional Convention. But all things considered, the Annapolis Convention did not achieve much. There just really weren't enough people there to even achieve much of anything. I think it was Alexander Hamilton who wrote like a little report, and they were basically like, all right, here's some things we discussed. Let's talk about it at what they were calling the Philadelphia Convention, which the Philadelphia Convention would become the Constitutional Convention. So, all right, Constitutional Convention starts. This is a big deal. It's actually, they decide it's going to be done in secret, and there were a few reasons for this. So that might sound a little suspicious. Why on earth are a bunch of politicians meeting in secret? And you're absolutely right to be thinking that. Nothing good ever happens when politicians meet in secret. But there were some valid reasons for that. So one of the first things is they wanted permission to speak freely. They didn't want to deal with political backlash from people. This was a giant and probably one of the most important brainstorming sessions in human history. And they're just throwing ideas out there and they're debating them. And they didn't want to deal with political backlash, which to me makes sense. They also wanted to avoid outside influence. They didn't want anyone in the delegates in there, couldn't speak. They didn't want any of the delegates to have to deal with answering to outside forces that had their own agendas, right? So they wanted to keep it a pure process. And also, their goal was to provide like a finished report or a finished something, right? They didn't want people to be involved in these really nitty gritty discussions and maybe be scared about what was going on or worried about, you know, what they were talking about one day, even though it was going to change the next day. But I think the most important part, the reason that it was kept secret, is because they were not supposed to be writing a constitution. So that's, you know, we call this the Constitutional Convention. They weren't actually supposed to be writing a constitution at all. That wasn't part of it. They were supposed to be revising the Articles of Confederation and bringing solutions to this revised Articles of Confederation. And when in reality, they were in there drafting the Constitution. So they weren't really supposed to be doing that. So there were a lot of reasons to keep it secret. It does make some sense. But again, as a general rule of thumb, when the government meets in private and doesn't want you to know what they're talking about, that's usually a little bit scary. But so what was proposed in this Constitutional Convention? Well, you have James Madison. He is from Virginia, and he pitches his Virginia plan. One of the biggest issues to resolve with the Articles of Confederation is how states would be represented in this new Congress or this new, governing body. And obviously you have the bigger states with bigger meaning more people in them thinking, well, obviously we should have our representation based on how many people are here because we have the most people. That makes the most sense. And the smaller states are being like, hang on just a second. Just because we don't have as many people as you doesn't mean that we shouldn't also have equal representation. So there's this back and forth going on. So James Madison, who's later going to be known as the father of the Constitution, he's kind of the guy that pushed for the Bill of Rights. So stay tuned we had so much to talk about him later. But so James Madison, he proposes this Virginia plan, which would be a bicameral house. When you think of think of bicycle, think of bifocals, think of, binoculars, where there's two of something. So that means two houses. So there would be two houses of this legislative branch. And they would be based on population, because remember, Virginia has more people. So he's a Virginian. He's thinking about his own state. Makes sense. So he's thinking that's how we should choose the representation. It should be done by population. But a really cool aspect of this form of government that Madison is proposing is he thinks we should have separation of powers, another one of my favorite parts about the Constitution, where you have separate and very independent branches of government. You've got executive, you've got legislative, you've got judicial, and they do their own thing, and they each keep each other in line. So that was one of Madison's biggest things. He's like, this is what we need to do. Overall, James Madison wanted a stronger central government. That was a big thing for him. Now, again, even though sometimes I read this and I'm like, okay, but how compatible is it with individual liberty? There's some great quotes from James Madison we'll go over in a later episode where he talks about the importance of having a rule of law like this to keep people in line. So we'll get to that later. So then we have another plan proposed, and this one is the New Jersey plan. Now, New Jersey is a smaller state, so this should not come as a surprise to you that New Jersey was saying, hey, wait a second, Virginia. We get it. You got a lot of people. That's great. We're really happy for you. We love that for you. But here's the thing. We don't have a lot of people. And what you're telling me is that now we don't get an equal voice in this new governing body. I don't think so. So New Jersey plan is basically saying, no, we need to pick representation equally, which means that every state gets the same amount of votes. That's what we're doing. That's how it should be. So that was a defining feature of the New Jersey plan. And oh my goodness, guys, when I talk about this, I get a headache, because where in the world does Alexander Hamilton get his ideas? So Alexander Hamilton, who we will have an entire episode about, I can't even say his name without wanting to rap the song. But Alexander Hamilton is a very complicated person. He is so admirable in so many ways. And in other ways, you're just like, but why? But why did you do that? And in this case, this guy gets up and he's like, hear me out. Yes, Britain wasn't great. We didn't love it. It wasn't great. But maybe this kind of like this monarchy thing, this like one ruler that rules until they die, like maybe that's great. But instead of Britain, it's America. So basically he's saying, let's do the same thing Britain did, but let's do it here. And it's like, all right, let's do tyranny, but let's do it American style. And that doesn't make any sense. Tyranny is tyranny. And it was a system set up to make it easy to oppress people. So this is a terrible idea. You'll notice that part was left out of the musical. They didn't bring up him wanting to propose this terrible idea with a lifetime president who was basically a king. But surprisingly enough, John Adams actually supported similar plans. And so it's interesting to see these people who were great patriots and really did love their country, but they thought that the same system was going to work as long as it was done in America. Like, we just need the right authoritarians, and that doesn't work. So Hamilton, what do they say in the South? Bless his heart. Bless his heart. I don't even know what he was thinking, but Hammy's plan is not popular anyway, so we don't have to worry about Hammy's plan. It gets shut down. But what they decide on is what's called the Connecticut Plan, or what was later known as the Great Compromise. And that you're gonna notice there's a lot of similarities between the Great Compromise and what we have now. All right, so we have this Great Compromise. What does that entail? Well, it has that bicameral legislature again, and I think this is genius. There's a lot of things I think are just so astounding about our Constitution, and I think this was such a great way to do it. So you're going to appease both the small states and the bigger states with this. So you're going to have one branch of this legislature, the Senate, where every state gets the same amount of representatives. And we have that today. Every state has 2 senators and only 2 senators. So that is going to be the first part of your legislature. Then you're going to have another one. We call it the House of Representatives today. And that is going to be where you have representation based on how many people are in your state. So a smaller state is going to have fewer representatives than a bigger state. But because these 2 houses have to work together, that makes perfect sense. And it was interesting. I was watching a video because I like to do a lot of research for these and hear other people's opinions that maybe aren't like mine. And this guy was saying like, oh, well, Canada does it better. And, the Senate And the House of Representatives, because there's two houses, like they can't get anything done and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's the whole point. I know you might be thinking like, wait a second, we want the Senate to get more done and to pass more bills. We want the House of Representatives to pass more bills. No, we don't, because usually when that happens, it's not always good for us, the people. And, we talked about the omnibus bills a couple episodes ago, and I told you that one of the biggest problems about that is that, congressmen will be given like a 900-page bill and said like, so like you have an hour to figure out if you want to vote for this, and then they have to vote or abstain. And so it's like getting things done quickly and getting them passed without taking a lot of thought into it is not the goal. Gridlock is the goal. This goal of like, no, let's have people really debating these. Let's have people like filibustering. Let's have people like really talking about these before we do anything with them. So this gridlock, this making it harder to pass things, that's a feature, not a bug, as we say. That was supposed to happen. So we get that. We have the separation of powers. We have the three branches of government. We have checks and balances. So this was a pretty good plan. But just because this was done here, and I think this is what confuses a lot of people. We think Constitutional Convention, great. Everyone's going to vote on it. They're going to be like, this is great. All right. That's it. That's how the Constitution became the law of the land, and that's not true. So the Constitutional Convention, which remember was just the Philadelphia Convention, they're just basically agreeing to a draft of something to present to the delegates of the states. So they finally have this draft. It's done. And then they go to the states and they're like, hey, look what we made you. We need you to take these now to your own state conventions and work on ratifying them. So this is only part one of what they were doing to actually get it ratified. Now, the Articles of Confederation worked on like you had to have every single state's buy-in before you could pass anything. And remember, that was seen as a bug to the system. So they didn't do that with the Constitution. When it came to states ratifying it, they said that they only needed to have 9 states ratify it. And so once they had their 9th state who did it, that's when the Constitution became like the law of the land. So in 1788, I think it was, yes, New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify it. They have all the votes they need. It gets ratified. George Washington becomes president in 1789. And then in 1791, you have the Bill of Rights adopted into the Constitution, which gives us those first 10 amendments. We'll talk about that separately. I'll do an episode on the Bill of Rights, just the history of it, because that's fascinating. But when it comes to dissecting each amendment, I think they each deserve their own episode. We've already done a few because there's just so much good stuff in there. That's like the meat of it. That's where you get your right to privacy. That's where you have free speech. There's so much good stuff in there. So Constitutional Convention, I think when we think about how it came to be, we think Constitutional Convention, it was signed, it was there. You hear the Ben Franklin quote where a woman was standing outside the convention hall saying, "What kind of government do we have?" And he says, "A republic if you can keep it." And what he meant by that, so there's a lot of talk about democracy. Democracy is great. It's the will of the people. But democracy is actually very tyrannical. It's just tyrannical by the majority, not tyrannical by an authoritarian. And so that famous Benjamin Franklin exchange, what he meant by that is a republic, meaning we are a representative government. We elect representatives to speak for us. So it is not a democracy. It is not a majority rule situation. And that's why I think the way that they separated Congress into those two houses is so fascinating, because they found a way, not a perfect way. Nothing is going to be perfect. A better way than that has ever been done ever in the history of the world. And if you don't believe me, do some research as a family and see how many constitutions were modeled after our U.S. Constitution and how many of them have survived since. You will see just how incredible the American Constitution is, because it paved the way and it has been so resilient, and it's actually withstood so many, even a civil war, there's so much that it was able to withstand. So the Constitution, not perfect, it is more perfect. It created a more perfect union, and it did something the world had never done before. And we are still standing after all this time. So really incredible. Take the time to maybe read the Constitution as a family to celebrate. Constitution Day is almost upon us in September. And maybe pick out some parts that really stand out to you as things that were revolutionary, not just for then, but for now. Things that still stand out is like, wow, how could these dead dudes from the past be so insightful to come up with exactly, problems that we'd still have to solve today. So yeah, do that. I think that would be really fun. I encourage you to do that. Let's spark some conversation, celebrate Constitution Day, doing something fun. And we will leave it there. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.